13,500 years ago, this exact patch of Earth was locked beneath the crushing weight of the last ice age. Where marble monuments and marble steps will one day rise, there is only wind-scoured tundra, gray gravel, and the distant groan of a retreating glacier somewhere to the north. A herd of massive, shaggy mammoths drifts across the frozen plain, their breath turning to fog in air so cold it could crack stone. No river yet carves its familiar path below. No hill yet holds the shape it will one day be known for. This is simply raw, frozen land, waiting. Everything you are about to see happens from one unmoving point of view. The camera never shifts, never tilts, never blinks. Only the land itself moves, compressing 13.5 millennia into a single unbroken transformation right in front of your eyes. Watch closely, because what happens next will happen faster than you think. As the ice begins its long retreat, the temperature climbs and the frozen ground softens into cold, wet marsh. Meltwater rivers braid across the valley floor, and for the first time, we see the outline of a channel that will one day be called the Potomac. Scrubby grasses push up through gravel. Small herds of caribou replace the mammoths, picking their way along the water's edge. The land is still nearly silent, but it is no longer dead. By 10,000 years before the Common Era, the climate has softened further. Spruce and pine forests creep in from the south, transforming the open tundra into a patchwork of woodland and meadow. Small bands of hunters move through this new forest, following game trails along the riverbank. They build no permanent structures here yet, only temporary shelters of bent branches and hide, but their footprints are the first human footprints this valley has ever known. Centuries blur into a green haze. By 9,000 years before the Common Era, oak and hickory begin to dominate the canopy, and the river below widens and calms. Fish move upstream in numbers thick enough to churn the water silver. The hunters who once passed through now return again and again, drawn by the abundance. They are not settling yet, but they are remembering this place. Here is where the story starts to surprise you. By 8,000 years before the Common Era, something remarkable happens along this riverbank: the first fire pits. Small, deliberate, and reused season after season. These hearths mark the earliest sign that people are choosing to stay longer, to return to the same bend in the river again and again rather than simply passing through. Smoke rises from the same general spot for generations, a thin gray thread tying human memory to this one location. By 7,000 years before the Common Era, temporary camps become seasonal camps. Woven fish traps stretch across shallow water. Simple bark shelters cluster near the tree line, disassembled and rebuilt with the turning of the seasons. The forest around them thickens into something close to what future settlers will one day call ancient. 6,000 years before the Common Era brings warmth, and with warmth comes plenty. Shellfish beds thrive in the calmer water downstream, and the people camped along this valley grow skilled at gathering them. Paths worn by repeated footsteps begin to crisscross the landscape, faint but permanent grooves in the earth. This is the beginning of infrastructure, long before anyone would ever use that word. By 5,000 years before the Common Era, semi-permanent villages appear along the riverbank for the first time. Circular clearings, ringed by simple pole-framed dwellings, replace the temporary camps of earlier centuries. Smoke curls from multiple hearths at once now, not just one. The valley has a heartbeat. 4,000 years before the Common Era, the forest canopy is now dense and mature, shading footpaths that have been worn smooth by thousands of years of use. Small garden plots appear near the villages, patches of cleared earth where wild plants are tended rather than simply gathered. Something is shifting in how people relate to this land. Keep watching, because the next 1,000 years will bring a change no one saw coming. By 3,000 years before the Common Era, larger villages rise along both banks of the widening river, connected by canoe traffic that leaves visible where on muddy landing sites. Trade goods, stone, shell, and worked wood move through this valley from places far beyond the horizon. This is no longer an isolated pocket of the world. It is a crossroads. 2,000 years before the Common Era brings palisade walls, tall wooden fences ringing the largest villages for protection and prestige alike. Corn cultivation spreads through the cleared fields, changing the rhythm of the seasons from pure gathering to something closer to farming. The population along this river has grown enough that neighboring villages now negotiate, trade, and occasionally clash over the richest fishing grounds. By 1,000 years before the Common Era, established communities this valley with a permanence earlier generations would not recognize. Longhouses stretched beside the water. Smoke from dozens of hearths hangs over the treeline every evening. This place has a name now, spoken in a language that will one day vanish from common use, but never fully disappear from this ground. The 1st century marks a turning point most people never learn about. By the year 100, the people who call this valley home, ancestors of those who will later be known as the Natchitoches, have built one of the most established riverside settlements in the entire region. Weirs stretch across the shallows, funneling fish into woven traps with startling efficiency. Canoes glide across water that has not changed its course in 1,000 years. 200 brings expanded cornfields stretching further back from the riverbank than ever before. Storage pits, lined and covered, the outskirts of the village, holding surplus food through leaner winters. The community here is thriving, self-sufficient, and utterly unaware of what lies centuries ahead. By the year 300, footpaths connecting this settlement to distant trading partners have widened into true trails, worn deep enough to survive centuries of disuse. Copper and shell ornaments, carried from hundreds of miles away, appear in the village for the first time, proof that this quiet river bend is part of a much larger world. 400. The village has grown large enough to require organized leadership, with structures near the center reserved for gatherings and decisions that affect the whole community. Fields stretch wider still, forest pushed back acre by acre through careful, deliberate burning that keeps the land productive. 500 brings a shift in building style. Larger, more permanent longhouses replace the smaller dwellings of earlier centuries, arranged in a clear, intentional pattern radiating outward from a central open space. This is no longer just a village. It is becoming something closer to a town. By 600, the riverside community has weathered flood, drought, and disease, and endured. Its population ebbs and swells with the decades, but the settlement itself never disappears. Smoke still rises here, morning after morning, generation after generation. 700. Trade routes running through this valley now stretch in every direction, carrying goods from the coast, from the mountains, and from river systems far to the west. This unassuming bend in the water has become a genuine hub, though its people could never guess what kind of hub it would one day become again. 800 brings expanded agriculture, with fields of corn, beans, and squash grown together in a pattern that will sustain communities here for the next 7 centuries without fail. 900. The forest surrounding the cleared village land has been shaped so thoroughly by human hands that a visitor from an earlier century would barely recognize it. Open, park-like, and carefully managed rather than truly wild. By 1,000 years after the Common Era, the settlement along this riverbank stands at what may be its historical peak of population, a thriving town of longhouses, fields, fishing weirs, and footpaths worn into permanent roads. And still, no one here has any idea that within 600 years, everything will change forever. The 11th century brings subtle shifts in village layout as leadership structures grow more complex, and by the 12th century, seasonal ceremonies draw visitors from neighboring settlements along the river in numbers large enough to require expanded gathering spaces. By the 13th century, this location has become one of the most recognized landmarks along the entire river system, a place travelers plan their journeys around. The 14th century brings a long stretch of relative stability. Fields expand, population holds steady, and the rhythm of planting, fishing, and trading continues largely unchanged. Then the 15th century arrives, and with it, the final calm before an unimaginable storm. By 1500, life along this river continues exactly as it has for centuries. Utterly unaware that far across an ocean no one here has ever seen, ships are already being built that will one day change everything. In 1510, nothing here has changed. In 1520, still nothing. But in 1530, faint rumors begin traveling up the trade networks. Stories past village to village of strange, pale-skinned travelers appearing along the coast far to the south and east. By 1540, those rumors have grown more frequent, more specific, and harder to dismiss. By 1550, Something has shifted in the air itself, an uneasy sense, passed quietly between elders, that the world beyond this river valley is no longer as distant as it once seemed. Traders who once spoke only of neighboring rivers now speak of floating villages with white wings, seen far downstream by cousins and in-laws who swear the stories are true. For the next several decades, the valley holds its breath. Then everything changes in a single generation. In the early 1600s, English ships sail up the river for the first time, their crews stunned by the size and organization of the riverside settlement they encounter. Captain John Smith himself charts this exact stretch of water, recording a thriving Natchitoches town on its banks, unaware that his maps will one day guide the founding of a nation's capital on this very ground. Within decades, English colonists established tobacco plantations along the river, and the landscape begins a transformation more rapid than anything the previous 13,000 years produced. Forests are cleared in wide swaths. Fields once devoted to corn now grow tobacco destined for ships bound across the ocean. By the mid-1600s, disease and displacement have devastated the Natchitoches community that thrived here for over 1,000 years, and the riverside village slowly falls silent. By the early 1700s, this stretch of land has become quiet plantation country, dotted with farmhouses, tobacco barns, and slave quarters, its ancient footpaths reduced to overgrown farm lanes. Nearby, a new port town called Georgetown rises along the water in 1749, and river traffic returns, though nothing here yet suggests a capital city is coming. Then, in 1790, an act of Congress changes this location forever. The Residence Act designates this exact stretch of land, along with the surrounding countryside, as the site of the new nation's permanent capital. Surveyors arrive within months, driving stakes into farmland and forest alike. A French-born engineer sketches a bold plan, a grand diagonal avenue connecting a hilltop reserved for a Congress house to a lower rise reserved for a president's house. That avenue will be named for the state of Pennsylvania, and it will run directly through the ground we have watched transform for 13 millennia. By 1792, the cornerstone of the Capitol building is laid on the hill above this avenue, and construction begins on the president's house at the opposite end. What was forest, then farmland, is now a muddy construction zone crawling with laborers, ox carts, and freshly cut stone, worked in part by enslaved laborers whose names were rarely recorded, but whose effort quite literally built the foundations of the Capitol. 1796 brings the avenue itself, a wide, unpaved dirt corridor cut directly through what was once forest, its edges lined with tree stumps and construction debris. By 1800, government offices begin relocating here from Philadelphia, and this rutted dirt road becomes, almost overnight, the most politically significant street in the entire country. But the young capital's peace will not last long. In 1814, British soldiers march up this very avenue and set fire to the Capitol and the president's house in full view of anyone watching from this vantage point. Flames light up the night sky above buildings barely 2 decades old. It is a devastating blow, but within years, reconstruction begins, and the avenue rises from its own ashes more determined than before. Through the 1820s and 30s, cobblestones finally replaced the mud, gas lamps begin lining the route, and permanent brick buildings crowd closer to the roadway than ever before. By the 1850s, a new, larger cast-iron dome begins rising above the Capitol, visible from this exact spot as an enormous new silhouette against the sky. Then, in 1861, war arrives. Union soldiers by the thousands march down this avenue toward encampments and battlefields beyond the city, their boots wearing the cobblestone smooth in a matter of months. Tents crowd nearby fields. By 1865, this same avenue carries a funeral procession unlike any the young capital has ever witnessed, honoring a president assassinated just days after the war's end. The decades that follow bring astonishing change at a pace this valley has never experienced before. By the 1870s, horse-drawn streetcars rattle down tracks laid directly into the avenue's surface. The 1880s bring electric arc lights replacing gas lamps for the first time, illuminating the street long after sunset. By the 1890s, grand hotels and office buildings rise shoulder to shoulder along the route, their stone facades replacing the last remaining wooden structures from the avenue's earliest days. The turn of the century brings automobiles rattling alongside horse carriages in an awkward, noisy transition. By 1910, motor cars have all but replaced horse traffic entirely, and the avenue's dirt shoulders finally disappear beneath continuous paving. 1920 brings massive new federal buildings rising along the route as the government itself grows larger than any previous generation could have imagined. By the 1930s, this avenue becomes a stage for public struggle and public hope alike, as economic hardship drives crowds here seeking change, even as new federal construction continues rising around them. 1941 thrust the country into a global war, and within years, this street fills with victory parades unlike anything witnessed since. By 1945, victory celebrations pack this same corridor with more people than it has ever held before, a sea of hats and flags stretching further than this fixed camera angle can fully capture. The 1950s bring quieter years, Cold War tensions simmering beneath a surface of orderly government routine, motorcades gliding past buildings that now look permanent, timeless, unshakable. The mid-20th century brings a wave of change that will test everything this avenue represents. By 1963, hundreds of thousands gather along and near this route in one of the largest peaceful demonstrations the nation has ever seen, calling for civil rights and equality. That same year, a different, somber procession moves down this avenue, mourning a president killed while still in office. By the late 1960s, the avenue itself has fallen into visible decline, its once grand buildings aging and underused even as the city around it continues to grow. Recognizing this decline, officials launch a major revitalization effort through the 1970s and 80s, restoring historic facades, planting new trees, and rebuilding public plazas along the entire corridor. By the 1990s, this avenue has been transformed once again, this time into a polished, ceremonial corridor befitting its role as the nation's most famous street. The new millennium brings its own set of transformations. Following events early in the 21st century, security barriers, checkpoints, and reinforced architecture reshape sections of this avenue in ways no one here could have anticipated even a decade earlier. Presidential inaugurations continue to fill this street with crowds numbering in the hundreds of thousands, a tradition now stretching back over 2 centuries. By 2020, an unprecedented public health crisis empties this normally bustling avenue of its usual crowds, leaving it eerily quiet for the first time in generations. 2021 brings both a historically unusual inauguration, surrounded by unprecedented security, and, weeks earlier, a moment of civil unrest at the Capitol grounds that will be studied and debated for years to come. By 2022, the avenue slowly returns to its familiar rhythm of tourists, commuters, and ceremonial processions. 2023 brings continued restoration work on historic buildings lining the route, preserving 2 centuries of architectural history for future generations. 2024 brings another presidential election cycle, filling this street once more with anticipation. By 2025, modern lighting, upgraded infrastructure, and careful preservation work have brought this avenue into a new era while still honoring the 2 centuries of history embedded in every stone beneath it. And now, in 2026, standing at this exact vantage point, it is almost impossible to imagine that this same ground once lay buried beneath Ice Age glaciers, once echoed with the footsteps of mammoth herds, once held a thriving riverside town older than most nations on Earth, and once watched a brand new capital rise from mud and forest into the most recognizable street in the world. Every rut worn by mammoth herds, every footpath carved by fishermen, every cobblestone laid by hand, every drop of paint on every rebuilt facade, all of it is still down there, buried beneath the surface of a street millions of people cross every year without a second thought. 13,500 years, captured in a single unbroken line of sight. And the story, quite obviously, is still being written.